Mrs. Evelyn had always loved her peaceful afternoon walks. She was a woman of grace and kindness, someone who had spent most of her life as a school teacher, guiding young minds with patience and wisdom. Now, in her retirement, she enjoyed simple moments, like sitting on a park bench, feeling the gentle breeze on her face, and watching children play. It was her way of enjoying the world, a world she had helped shape through decades of teaching. On this particular day, she had gone to the local park as usual, carrying a small bag with a book and a bottle of water. The sun was warm but not too hot, and the trees offered just the right amount of shade. She found her favorite bench, the one near the flower garden, and sat down with a content smile. As she opened her book, she felt a deep sense of peace. It was in places like this that she felt closest to the world around her, where she could simply exist without any worries. But that peace did not last long. A police officer, tall and broad-shouldered, walked toward her. His uniform was crisp, and his face was stern. Mrs. Evelyn noticed the way he looked at her, not with kindness or curiosity, but with suspicion. She had seen that look before, in a time when things were different, when people like her had to be careful about where they went and how they carried themselves. The officer stopped right in front of her bench, casting a shadow over her. "Ma'am," he said in a tone that was not exactly rude, but certainly not friendly. "Can I see some identification?" Mrs. Evelyn looked up from her book, a little surprised. She had done nothing wrong. "Excuse me?" she asked politely. "ID, please," the officer repeated. His eyes were cold, as if he had already decided something about her. Mrs. Evelyn blinked, trying to understand what was happening. "Why do you need to see my ID?" she asked gently, hoping that maybe there was some misunderstanding. The officer's jaw tightened. "We're checking for trespassers," he said, glancing around. "This is a public park, but we've had some reports of suspicious activity." Mrs. Evelyn felt a strange heaviness in her chest. She had been coming to this park for years. She had seen officers walking by before, but none of them had ever asked for her ID. And now, here she was, an elderly woman, being questioned for simply sitting on a bench and reading a book. A few people nearby started to glance in their direction. Some looked concerned, others curious. A young man with a phone in his hand seemed to be recording. Mrs. Evelyn kept her calm. "Officer, I have been coming to this park for years. I don't see anyone else being asked for their ID," she said, her voice steady but firm. The officer's expression remained hard. "Just show me your ID, Mom, and there won't be any problems." The peaceful afternoon had taken a sudden, uneasy turn. Mrs. Evelyn could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, but she would not let fear take over. She had spent her life teaching young people to stand up for what was right. Now, she had to do the same for herself. Mrs. Evelyn took a deep breath, keeping her hand steady as she closed her book. The officer in front of her stood tall, his eyes watching her closely, waiting for her to obey. But something about the way he spoke, the way he looked at her, made her feel uneasy. She had seen this kind of behavior before, and it was never about simple questions. It was about power. It was about making someone feel small. She looked around the park. The children were still playing. The birds were still chirping. But now, a few people had stopped what they were doing. They were watching. Some had concern on their faces. Others whispered to each other. A young woman sitting on a nearby bench held her phone up, as if she was recording. Mrs. Evelyn didn't know her, but she was grateful that someone else was paying attention. "Sir," she said calmly, looking up at the officer, "I am sitting here quietly, minding my own business. Why do you need to see my ID?" The officer's expression hardened. "Ma'am, I don't have time for questions. Either show me your ID or we'll have a problem." Mrs. Evelyn's heart pounded, but she refused to show any fear. She had lived too many years, seen too much in her lifetime, to let one man with a badge intimidate her. She reached into her purse slowly, not because she was afraid, but because she wanted to be careful. The last thing she wanted was for him to misunderstand her movements. But as she did, something changed in the officer's face. He stepped closer, his hand resting near his belt. "Make it quick," he muttered, his voice lower now. Mrs. Evelyn paused. A strange chill ran through her. Why was he acting this way? She was an elderly woman, sitting on a park bench. Why was he treating her like she was doing something wrong? A few more people had stopped to watch now. She could hear a murmur spreading through the small crowd. Someone whispered, "What is he doing? She's just sitting there." Mrs. Evelyn took out her wallet and held it out with steady hands. "Here it is," she said, her voice unwavering. "Now tell me, officer, what exactly am I suspected of?" The officer grabbed her ID, barely glancing at it before looking back at her. He seemed irritated that she hadn't been frightened into silence. "Like I said, we're checking for trespassers." She frowned. "In a public park." The officer's jaw tightened. He didn't like being questioned. "You don't get to decide how I do my job, ma'am." Mrs. Evelyn stared at him, unblinking. "And you don't get to treat people however you want just because you wear a uniform." The people around them were listening now, some recording, others murmuring in agreement. The tension in the air thickened. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed the officer's face. But he wasn't backing down yet. Not now. "Just stay where you are," he ordered. "We'll see what else comes up." Mrs. Evelyn didn't move. She had nothing to hide. But she could feel it in her bones. This wasn't over yet. Mrs. Evelyn sat still on the bench, her hands resting in her lap, but inside, her heart was beating faster. The officer still stood over her, gripping her ID like it was a dangerous weapon. His eyes darted to the growing crowd, noticing the murmurs and the phones recording. For a moment, his jaw tightened, as if he realized this situation was slipping out of his control. She had been in uncomfortable situations before, but this felt different. She had done nothing wrong. She was just sitting, reading, and enjoying the afternoon. And yet this man in uniform was treating her like a suspect. A young woman stepped forward, her voice loud enough to be heard. "Why is she being questioned? She's just sitting here." Another person added, "Yeah, we've been here too. Why aren't you asking for our IDs?" The officer turned his head toward them, his expression hard. "This doesn't concern you," he said sharply. "Stay back." Mrs. Evelyn looked up at him, her voice calm but firm. "It does concern them, and it concerns me too. You stopped me without reason, and now you want to keep me here as if I'd done something wrong." The officer exhaled sharply through his nose. He wasn't used to people talking back to him, especially in front of an audience. Still holding her ID, he pulled out a small device from his belt, typing something into it. "We're running a check," he said flatly. Mrs. Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "A check for what?" The officer didn't answer. He was stalling. And now, even he could feel that the eyes of the public were not on her. They were on him. More voices from the crowd rose. "You're wasting her time. This isn't right." A little girl holding her father's hand whispered, "Daddy, why is that policeman being mean to the lady?" Mrs. Evelyn felt something inside her stir, a deep sadness. This wasn't just about her. This was about everyone watching, about what that little girl was learning by witnessing this moment. She straightened her shoulders, her voice clear and steady. "Officer, if I am not under arrest, I believe I have the right to leave." The officer hesitated. He could feel the weight of the moment, the way the crowd was no longer just watching but expecting him to do something. But what could he do? He had nothing on her. She had done nothing wrong. Yet, instead of admitting his mistake, he doubled down. "Just stay put, ma'am. We're making sure everything checks out." Mrs. Evelyn sighed. This was no longer about a simple ID check. This was about control, about proving a point. She didn't say anything else. She simply sat there, waiting. But deep down, she knew one thing for certain. This officer had no idea what was coming next, because her son was on his way. The air around the park felt heavy, thick with tension. Mrs. Evelyn remained seated, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. She had done nothing wrong, and she would not allow herself to be treated like she had. The officer still held her ID, standing over her like a mountain, unwilling to step down. People in the park were no longer just passing glances. They were fully watching now. Some whispered among themselves. Others held up their phones, recording every moment. The officer glanced around, his fingers twitching slightly. He knew he was being watched, but instead of stopping, he dug in deeper. Mrs. Evelyn noticed the way his posture stiffened, as if he was bracing himself. He still hadn't answered her question. What was he checking? What reason did he have for keeping her here? She had a feeling that even he didn't have an answer. Then, in the distance, the sound of a car door closing echoed through the air. A tall figure moved across the park, walking with steady purpose. A man in a sharp suit, his tie loosened slightly, his eyes filled with focused determination. Michael had arrived. Mrs. Evelyn's son was a well-respected attorney, known for his strong sense of justice and his sharp mind. He had spent years fighting cases, standing up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. And now he was here for his mother. The officer hadn't noticed him yet, still busy acting as if he was in control. But the moment Michael stepped into the scene, the mood shifted. His voice rang out, steady and firm. "Excuse me, officer." The officer turned, his expression changing the moment he saw Michael. The confidence on his face flickered, just for a second. "Who are you?" he asked, though his voice lacked the same sharpness it had before. "I'm Michael Evans, and you're holding my mother's ID." For the first time, the officer hesitated. His fingers gripped the ID a little tighter as he tried to regain his composure. "This is just a routine check." Michael cut him off. "A routine check? In a public park, where she's been sitting quietly. I'd love to hear exactly what law you believe she's breaking." His tone was calm, but it carried weight. The kind of weight that came from experience, from knowledge. The kind of weight that made people listen. The crowd had grown completely silent, hanging on every word. Mrs. Evelyn watched her son, a small sense of relief washing over her. She had raised him to be strong, to be smart, and most of all, to always stand up for what was right. And now he was doing exactly that. The officer shifted uncomfortably. He had gone from being the one in control to the one being questioned. And the worst part, he had no real answer. Michael took a step closer. "Give my mother back her ID. Now." The officer swallowed hard. His face had lost all confidence. For the first time, he looked pale. The silence in the park was thick. All eyes were on Michael and the officer. The once confident officer, who had been so firm in his actions just moments ago, now looked unsure. His grip on Mrs. Evelyn's ID tightened for a brief second before he exhaled sharply. Michael didn't back down. His face remained calm, his voice steady, but there was a quiet strength behind his words. "I'll ask again," he said, his gaze locked onto the officer. "Give my mother back her ID." The officer hesitated. He looked at the crowd around him, the people recording, the whispers growing louder. He had started this thinking it would be just another routine encounter, one where he controlled the situation. But now, the power had shifted. Mrs. Evelyn watched as her son stood tall, unshaken. She had always known he was strong, but at this moment, she saw the fire in his eyes. He wasn't just defending her. He was standing up for every person who had ever been treated unfairly. The officer cleared his throat. "Sir, this is just a security check," he tried to explain, though his voice had lost its authority. Michael raised an eyebrow. "A security check? In a public park? On a retired school teacher who was doing nothing but reading a book? What exactly made you think my mother was a threat?" The officer had no response. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. He was trapped in his own actions. The people watching knew it. The cameras recording knew it. And most importantly, Michael knew it. Realizing he had no way out, the officer finally gave in. He reached into his hand, and slowly extended Mrs. Evelyn's ID back to her. "Here," he said, his voice lower than before. Mrs. Evelyn took it, her movements graceful and composed. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The moment spoke for itself. Michael, however, wasn't done. "Now, officer," he said, his voice still firm, "I want your badge number." The officer's eyes widened slightly. His face had gone pale. He glanced around as if looking for support, but there was none. Even his fellow officers, who had arrived and stood a few feet away, didn't step in to defend him. They knew the situation had turned against him. The officer hesitated, then sighed in defeat. He gave Michael his badge number. Michael nodded. "Good. Now, I expect a formal apology to my mother. Right now." The officer's face flushed. He glanced at Mrs. Evelyn, who was still seated, still dignified. He looked at the watching crowd, the recording phones, and finally back at Michael. "I apologize," he muttered. Michael crossed his arms. "Louder." The officer clenched his jaw, then straightened his back and said, "I apologize, Mom." Mrs. Evelyn gave him a small nod but didn't say anything. She didn't need his apology. She had already won. And as the officer took a step back, the crowd watching knew it too. The tension in the air slowly began to shift. The officer, who had once stood over Mrs. Evelyn with confidence, now looked uncomfortable. He had just apologized, but the damage had already been done. The people watching knew it. The cameras recording knew it. And Michael knew it too. Mrs. Evelyn finally stood up from the bench, her movements slow but full of dignity. She adjusted her purse over her shoulder and looked the officer in the eye. There was no anger on her face, only quiet strength. "I hope you think carefully about how you treat people in the future," she said softly. Her voice wasn't harsh, but it carried weight. The officer nodded stiffly, unable to meet her gaze for long. Michael took a deep breath, then turned to the growing crowd. "Thank you all for staying and making sure this was seen," he said, his voice steady. A few people clapped softly. Others nodded in agreement. The young woman who had been recording stepped forward. "I have the whole thing on video," she said. "If you need it, I can send it to you." Michael smiled slightly. "That might be helpful. Thank you." The officer took another step back, clearly eager to leave. He motioned to his colleagues, and they started to move away. The moment was over for them, but for everyone else, it was something they wouldn't forget. Mrs. Evelyn turned to her son. "You didn't have to make a scene," she said gently. Michael sighed, shaking his head. "Mom, I had to. You were being treated unfairly." She patted his arm. "I know, and I'm proud of you." They began walking away together, the afternoon sun still shining down on the park, as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed. The people who had witnessed the moment had seen something important, that standing up for what's right matters, no matter how small the action may seem. As they reached the park entrance, Michael glanced at his mother. "Are you okay?" Mrs. Evelyn smiled. "I've been through worse," she said with a chuckle. "But it's good to know I raised a son who won't let things like this go unnoticed." Michael shook his head. "It shouldn't have to be this way," he said quietly. She nodded, understanding. "No, it shouldn't. But today, you made a difference." Michael exhaled and looked back at the park one last time. The officer was gone, but the lesson remained. As they stepped into their car, Mrs. Evelyn glanced at her son. "Now, since you're here, how about we go get some pie?" Michael laughed, the tension finally breaking. "Pie sounds good, Mom." With that, they drove off, leaving behind a moment that had shown the power of standing up, speaking out, and never allowing injustice to go unnoticed. As Michael drove, the silence in the car felt peaceful, not heavy like before. The stress from the park had started to fade, replaced by a quiet understanding between mother and son. Mrs. Evelyn looked out of the window, watching the familiar streets pass by. Despite everything that had happened, she felt calm. Michael glanced at her. "Are you sure you're okay?" he asked again, his voice softer this time. She smiled gently. I told you, son. I've been through worse. He sighed, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. It just makes me angry, Mom. You were sitting there, reading a book, and he treated you like a criminal. If I hadn't shown up. He trailed off, shaking his head. Mrs. Evelyn reached over and patted his hand. But you did show up, and that's what matters. Michael exhaled, his shoulders relaxing a little. I just don't get it. Why do things like this still happen? She gave him a knowing look. Because some people don't change easily. But do you know what I've learned over the years? He glanced at her. What? She smiled. Change doesn't come from arguing with people like that, officer. Change comes when people see the truth and stand up for it. And today, you showed everyone what standing up looks like. Michael thought about that as he pulled into the parking lot of their favorite diner. It was a small, cozy place where they had been coming for years. The kind of place where the waitresses knew your name, and the pie was always fresh. As they stepped inside, the smell of warm cinnamon and baked apples filled the air. A friendly waitress, Maria, spotted them and waved. Well, look who's here. Ms. Evelyn and her handsome son. Mrs. Evelyn chuckled. Hello, Maria. We're here for some of that famous pie. Maria led them to their usual booth by the window, setting down 2 menus even though she already knew what they would order. 2 slices of apple pie and some coffee, she guessed. Mrs. Evelyn nodded. You know me too well. Michael gave a small smile. And maybe an extra scoop of ice cream. Maria winked, coming right up. As they waited, Mrs. Evelyn watched her son carefully. She could see he was still thinking about what had happened. He had always been like this. Passionate, determined, unwilling to let things slide. It was what made him such a good attorney. You know, she said, breaking the silence. When you were little, you used to get so upset if you saw another kid being treated unfairly. You'd march right up to them and demand they apologize. Michael chuckled. I guess some things never change. She nodded. And that's a good thing. The world needs more people who won't stay silent. Just then, Maria returned with their pie and coffee, setting it down with a smile. Enjoy, you too. As Michael took his first bite, he finally felt a little lighter. Maybe his mother was right. Maybe change was slow, but moments like today mattered. And as long as he had a voice, he would always use it for what was right. Michael and Mrs. Evelyn sat in their booth, enjoying their warm apple pie, the sweet taste mixed with the comforting hum of the diner, making the moment feel lighter. For a little while, they didn't talk about what had happened in the park. Instead, they simply enjoyed their food and the company of each other. After a few bites, Michael leaned back and sighed. This is good, he admitted. His mother smiled. I told you. There's nothing that a good slice of pie can't make a little better. Michael chuckled. I wish the world worked like that. Mrs. Evelyn stirred her coffee slowly. The world is complicated, son, but that doesn't mean we stop trying to make it better. Michael nodded, his thoughts still heavy. I keep thinking about that officer. He really thought he was in the right. He didn't even seem to understand why what he was doing was wrong. Mrs. Evelyn took a sip of her coffee before answering. Some people go through life without ever questioning their own actions. They do what they've always done, thinking it's normal, even when it hurts others. Michael sighed. Do you think he'll change? She thought for a moment. I don't know, but I do know that he won't forget today. When you stood up to him, when all those people were watching, something shifted. Maybe he'll think twice next time before treating someone unfairly. Michael nodded. I hope so. Just then, Maria returned to their table, refilling their coffee cups. You two look deep in thought, she said with a knowing smile. Michael smiled back. Just talking about the world. Maria chuckled. Ah, that's a big topic. But I'll tell you something my grandmother used to say. Small acts of kindness and courage add up. You never know whose heart you're changing just by doing the right thing. Mrs. Evelyn nodded in agreement. That's very true. Michael looked at his mother, then at Maria, and something inside him felt lighter. Maybe they were right. Maybe real change wasn't always about big speeches or courtrooms. Maybe it started in moments like these, standing up when it mattered, showing kindness even when it was hard, and refusing to stay silent in the face of injustice. As they finished their pie, Michael reached for the check, but Maria waved him off. "This one's on me," she said. Mrs. Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "Maria, you don't have to do that." Maria smiled warmly. "I know, but I want to. Consider it a thank you for reminding people that doing the right thing still matters." Michael and Mrs. Evelyn exchanged a glance, then smiled. As they left the diner and stepped outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow over the street. Michael took a deep breath, feeling a sense of peace. "Come on, Mom," he said, opening the car door for her. "Let's go home." And as they drove away, he knew one thing for sure. No matter how slow change was, he would never stop fighting for it.